What's happening, you guys? Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Ayman. I do a weekly true crime series, which you're watching right now, simply because I like reading about dark and twisted shit that people do. Don't we all? That's why you're watching this right now. Now, I love vampires, honestly. I read all the Twilight books. I've watched all the movies countless times. Love them, I don't care what you say. And yes, Team Jacob all the way. I've also read a lot of the Vampire Diaries and seen the whole show twice. Yes, of course, Team Damon, come on now. And it's so funny because anytime someone asks me what mythical creature I could be, it's always a vampire. Like, who doesn't want to be immortal? But real life vampires are far from glittery and romantic, and such was the case with today's victim, Lilly Lindestrom, back in 1932. This is the notorious vampire murder. On to the victim. Now, Lilly Lindestrom was born on the 29th of August 1900 in the city of Malmö, Sweden. Now, because this case is so old and all the articles and sources pertaining to the case mostly concentrate on the assailant rather than the victim, so not a lot is known about Lily's early life. I do know that she got married and divorced before she turned 22 and then moved to Stockholm for a fresh start. Now, going into prostitution wasn't really a choice for her. I mean, let's look at the socio-historical context. The 20s led into the Great Depression of the 30s, and so to make any semblance of cash, she became an escort in April of 1931. Now, Lilly was also playfully nicknamed the cool girl due to her job and the fact that she was the only person in her building to have a telephone. And so instead of getting clients on the street, she'd make bookings on the phone, and her job was quite lucrative. She had a decent amount of money to buy luxurious items back then, like radios, for example. Now onto the case. It was the 4th of May 1932. Lily's neighbor Minnie Jonsson realized she hadn't seen or heard from Lily in a few days, so she got quite worried since A, she lives alone, and B, she worked as a prostitute, so concerns about her safety were very justified. And since Minnie was a sex worker herself, she knew all too well what came with the job. So she decided to call the police to the scene, and they entered her apartment to quite a sight. Lily's body was naked, laying face down on the bed, and her clothes were bizarrely folded on a chair nearby. There were 3 pillows stacked on top of her body, and clearly sexual activity had occurred because they found a condom coming out of her anus, for, lack of a better word, her arse. It was concluded that 3 blows to the back of the head were what ultimately killed her. But the weirdest part of the whole murder was that there was absolutely no blood spatters anywhere. Usually that's a really good way to figure out the assailant's trajectory, which direction they had hit her from, if they too were bleeding in case she fought back. But not only were there no blood spatters, Lily's body had been completely drained of blood. There was a blood-soaked tea towel in the kitchen, and that was about it. Officers also noticed saliva on her face and neck, which led them to believe the killer was a vampire who drained her of her blood before fleeing the scene. Okay, if it is a vampire, I doubt he really needs to flee from the scene. Like, I'm sure he has super strength or some sort of ability to, really overpower the police. Anywho, on to the investigation. Now, the police didn't really have any leads to the murder suspect except for the fact they knew he must have been a client of Lily's. Many shared that on the 30th of April, her and Lily were hanging out when she got a phone call from a client. The person was close by and was going to come soon for a session of hubdy. Minnie described his voice as sounding nice and well-behaved, and then went on to recount the events of the day she last saw her friend. At around 7 p.m. the same day, Lily was already in her apartment with the client/murderer, and she came down to Minnie's apartment twice asking about condoms. At around 9 p.m, Minnie knocked on Lily's door, wanting to ask if she was ready to come to the bonfire with her as they discussed earlier in the day. There was no answer, so she just assumed that Lily had already left the bonfire with her client. But when Minnie and her friends got to the bonfire, Lilly was nowhere to be found. After another one of their friends failed to contact Lilly, the duo went to see the building's landlords, who also hadn't seen her in days. Ruth Johnson, one of the landlords, also mentioned that Lilly and her had a plan to meet on the 2nd of May, but Lilly didn't show up for that either. And then of course on the 4th the police got involved, and you know what happened after that. Now, despite clinging on to the vampire explanation, there were no puncture wounds found on her body, so how could the person have drained her of all her blood? The police interviewed every one of Lilly's clients, but all of them were ruled out. No one saw the assailant leave her apartment either, and no one heard any screaming or struggling coming from her apartment. The morning after the murder, the apartment next to Lilly's was robbed by a young man. He was trying to access a locked storage closet and tried to muffle the woman inside from screaming, but she quickly escaped ASAP Rocky and called for the police. Could the burglar have been the same man who killed Lilly? Possibly. And the worst part was that forensic testing also hadn't really been that developed at this point, so although the police had many sets of fingerprints, saliva, and used condoms, aka a DNA cesspool, none of it could be used to help track down the suspect. And that sucks. Onto the theory/suspects. Now, before I get into the theories and the suspects, there's one important thing I need to note and that I need you guys to know. Now, because of the indetectable way Lilly's blood was removed from her body, the suspect had to be someone that had the medical knowledge to be able to effectively expel all her blood. Now, I don't know if any of the suspects or theories include anyone with a medical background, so that's why I'm already like sus about it. Anywho, disclaimer over, theory number 1. The first theory, which I think is the most viable out of all of them, is the fact the suspect lived in the same building as Lilly. And this conclusion was reached due to various factors. Now, firstly, because nearly all of her blood had been expelled and the risk of clotting, the killer would have had to have been quick with storing the blood and taking it to wherever he lived. He had to be fast, and no one's about to walk through the center of Atlas with God knows how many pints of blood, hence he must have never had to leave the building. But this was disputed by the fact that on the night of the murder itself, a man was spotted inside Norma's cafe with a porcelain container the waitress knew belonged to Lilly. Now, why would the killer stop for some steak dinner on the way home? Unless, of course, he had already dropped off the blood at his house. Theory number 2. The second theory that is also pretty baseless is the notion the killer was a police officer and that the murder weapon was a police baton. The apartment was cleaned so immaculately and scrubbed of clues before the police even got there, which makes you think the suspect knew what the police would be looking for. But I feel like any killer would be trying to clean up his tracks and think about what the police would be looking for. That doesn't mean it was a police officer. There was no murder weapon found at the scene, meaning the person brought it with them and took it back. Does this point to it being a baton? Possibly, but not definitely. So I feel like that theory is pretty shaky in my opinion. And also, I'm sorry the lighting today is so bad. There was no place. I didn't know where else to record, honestly. I'm sorry, you guys. And finally, on to theory number 3. The third and final theory focuses on a pimp by the name of Peterson. His own wife was the one that called the police on him after seeing him covered in blood. Officers took him into custody for 10 days, but eventually had to let him go after his alibi checked out, but it checked out shakily at best. I mean, did he have an explanation of why he was covered in blood? I'm sure it was some bullshit that he spewed. So I feel like it could have possibly been him. It could have been someone in the building. Did they check everyone in the building? I don't know. There's not, that many records of what the police did after, the fact. And that is the case, you guys. Let me know what you guys think. I love vampire-esque cases like this. There was a prolific serial killer in Dusseldorf. I think it was the Vampire of Dusseldorf, who literally would cut people's throats open and just watch the blood literally spew across the room. I don't know if he drank it. I think he took it. I don't know if he drank it, but I feel like he's more vampiric than this guy. You know what I mean? Let me know your theories in the comments below. As always, I have been your favorite true crime junkie, Ayman, and I will catch you in the next one. And I really like my outfit today. Anyway, bye guys.